Well, welcome everybody. I hope you managed to find the session all right without too many technical issues. So this is one of the last sessions of the Decarbonate conference this year, and what we're looking to cover this time is delivering real zero from strategy to action. And just to introduce myself, so my name is Rebecca Powell. I work for Arup as a senior planner, and I do a lot of work in sustainability and decarbonisation, particularly in the north of England. So that's kind of where my knowledge comes from primarily. And I'm really happy to be the chair of this session today. Just to give a bit of a background, so the idea for this session came about following the issue of the Department for Transport's Decarbonising Transport Plan, which came out earlier this year. And as well as that, we know that there are lots of other regional and local authorities that are working towards zero carbon, but also on a much kind of steeper trajectory than the government's trajectory, which is 2050. So we're seeing loads of organisations developing strategies for decarbonisation, and yet the crucial step really is in implementing those policies within the strategy to make a difference. So it's all very well having a great plan, but if you don't do anything about it, then we don't get any further to our goals. So we're finding that a lot of the authorities that we work with are finding that transition particularly difficult. So we thought it might be quite interesting to explore, that area to see how different places are finding it maybe easier or harder, and to try and share some learning around this space so that we can see and accelerate this move towards zero carbon. I will just share my screen and then I'll just talk you through the agenda for the day. So might be easier. It's nice and smooth. Okay. So hopefully you can all see that there. So just to talk you through who we've got today. So we've got two speaker slots to start the session with 3 speakers between them. So first of all, we've got Karen Barrass from UK 100. So she's going to talk about the local authority powers related to climate action based on some research that UK 100 have done recently. We then should have a bit of time for question and answers on Karen's presentation, maybe 5 minutes or so just to clarify any points or just ask her to elaborate on specific things. The next speaking session will be David Munro from the Welsh Government and Ben Pritchard from Arup. So they're doing a joint session covering a load of work that's been happening over in Wales in the decarbonising transport space. And I think that there's lots of lessons that we can learn from there, certainly in England, from the progress that's been made over in Wales. So I expect that to last probably around 35 minutes, the whole speaking sessions. And then after that, we will have a panel discussion. So that's really your opportunity to kind of join in the discussion on specific topics. So if there's anything you'd like to explore in this space from strategy to delivery, then that's the time to do that. So we'll do that hopefully for around 35 minutes. And then at the end of the session, we're looking to have these networking breakout rooms. So some of the sessions of the conference will have had these breakout rooms as well. It basically gives you an opportunity to explore this in a bit more of an interactive way. So you can speak to smaller groups and engage more verbally. The way that we want to run this is if you could stay muted throughout the session, obviously apart from the speakers, and then if you can add your questions as we go to the chat box, and then I'll try and pick up those questions and field them back to the relevant speaker, and then we can have a bit of discussion. So we're kind of trying to channel this through the chat box, if that works. So I'll stop sharing. I think that pretty much covers everything as an introduction, and I'll hand over to Karen.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, I'm just moving various different bits of Zoom windows around. Bear with me for 1 second whilst I get sorted. There we go. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm from UK 100. I'm the Policy and Research Manager. And for those of you that may be unfamiliar with UK 100, we are a network of highly ambitious local government leaders who are all tackling the day-to-day delivery of action against the climate emergency to deliver net zero. We have a subset of 60 plus local government leaders who have all committed to delivering net zero ahead of the government targets. So they've set targets of 2030 for their council emissions and 2045 for their community-wide emissions. So this group of leaders are really demonstrating ambition, and we at UK 100 are working with them to help deliver on this ambition, and also where it's relevant to do so, advocating for change at the national level to help facilitate the sorts of policy implementation, or rather remove the sorts of policy implementation challenges that they may be facing day to day on the ground. So as a part of this building evidence base for the support for taking local action on net zero, we commissioned a piece of research from Quantum earlier on this year in April, and it was basically the most comprehensive undertaking to look at the powers that local authorities currently have to deliver net zero across all sectors. So we looked at buildings, energy, and waste and transport. And what we came up with was a report that was over 100 odd pages long, with fantastic level of detail about where local authorities currently have capacity to take action to deliver net zero and where some of the blockages are. Now, it's been fairly well received. I think it's especially timely given that the Climate Change Committee and the National Audit Office have also both highlighted the fundamentally important role that local authorities have to play in delivering net zero. It's been described by James Kirkup from the Social Market Foundation as annoyingly good, so we'll take that as positive feedback. But being such a large and detailed document, we took the decision to develop a series of insight briefings, some that were aimed at national policymakers and some that are more useful for local policy makers and not just our members, but across the board. So I've had the real pleasure of working with Greg Marsden from Leeds on the transport briefings. And I'm just going to share some of the insight that has come out of these with you today, specifically around the local insight briefing. And I'll just pop a link once I've finished speaking to the briefing in the chat so that you can have a look at it. So in between the Power Shift report coming out and the briefings coming out, hopefully the government released the transport decarbonisation plan, and it was a really welcome, I think, policy document. It's more ambitious in many ways than any transport policy document that we've seen in the past 30 years, and that it finally highlighted that perhaps endless growth delivering lots of induced demand was perhaps not the right way to go. But for UK 100 and for our members, what it really demonstrated in practice is how much of an important role local authorities have to play in delivery on net zero transport in the UK. And I've just highlighted one quote here in my slide. For transport, local and regional level organisations are often best placed to make decisions that will deliver the practical changes required, as well as ensuring local communities and businesses are engaged. So that is kind of an overarching highlight of how important local authorities will be. But if we look at the details of what's covered in the transport decarbonisation plan, you'll see that across the board in the transport sector, the local authorities have a role to play. And I've just tried to succinctly highlight here across the board how much of an important role they have to play. So in terms of changing travel behaviour, local authorities have a role to deliver demand responsive transport, cycling infrastructure, car clubs and education to encourage that behaviour change. In terms of reducing the need to travel, all of the planning implications that come with that and space reallocation will all be delivered at the local level. Influencing behaviour through charging, congestion charging, low emission zones, parking, these are all local authority decisions. And their own fleets, they are obviously fleet owners, so making the decisions where they have oversight over bus companies to make those buses ultra low and zero emission, around their fleet vehicles, and around the provision of freight and cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes in the area. So you can see that we're not talking about one intervention will be required of the local level. Across the spectrum, the local areas will be fundamentally important to delivering. And what PowerShift and the PowerShift briefings have identified are 4 key areas where change is urgently needed in order to facilitate the sorts of policy interventions that will be needed across all of those aspects of the transport sector in order to be effective in their work on reaching net zero. So the first of these is simply the fact that local authorities need more control and oversight over particular areas of the transport network that they currently don't have. So they ultimately need purview over all of the transport decisions that are place-based in their local vicinity. And that includes improving the influence that they have on rail service provision, the limited influence that they currently have over private sector bus partners. And as I'm sure we're all familiar with, the local authorities currently have no ability to directly impact Highways England on strategic road network decisions that run through their jurisdictions. So we know that this sort of transformation is possible because we know in London that the powers already exist across the piece, and that it's possible to have a cohesive network. So it's not an outlandish ask to deliver this, but ultimately local authorities need more control and oversight of those decisions if they're going to affect the sort of change that we need to see. Secondly, more funding needs to be devolved to local authorities to deliver net zero in locally appropriate ways. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan lists 15 different sources of funding where local authorities can access it, but they all have their own terms and conditions. And not every local authority has the capacity, the in-house skills or expertise to be able to put itself forward for that money to invest in that way. So we need to see a reform, and I think that for me one of the key barriers that came out of the PowerShift report was in this respect. There is a real barrier to entry for a lot of local authorities that aren't at the vanguard, that aren't the most ambitious, and I think that there also needs to be acknowledgement of the context in which many local authorities operate. So UK 100 is we have a subset of our members called the Countryside Climate Network, who are all rural local authorities, both unitary county councils and district local authorities. And for those authorities, there is a real issue around cost effectiveness bids, because the business case in rural areas is never going to be the same as it is in big cities. And that's why this element of the need to shift funding to be more equitable across the piece and make sure that it works for authorities, regardless of what level or tier they are, is very important, because ultimately local transport needs to be delivered everywhere. And we need to be mindful of the fact that everywhere doesn't have the same solution. The third priority that was identified, and I've alluded to it a little bit there, is in terms of the capacity of local authorities and the range of expertise to deliver on the transition. You saw from the slide how comprehensive the list of asks are, and I think that a lot of local authorities will have limited ability to deliver unless the transport decarbonisation toolkit comes with insight and provision in terms of addressing that gap. And finally, and I'm sure we've heard this a lot this week in various different sessions, but political will is critical. There are a lot of difficult decisions, I think, that need to be made in the transport sector to ensure that we move towards zero emissions. In terms of road space allocation, planning, for example, they're two, I think, that difficult discussions will need to be had around those. And I think that in looking at the spectrum of local authorities in the UK, all 300 odd of them, they're not all at the same point of their journey. And I think that a lot of local authorities aren't yet at the point of having those difficult conversations and figuring out what net zero means for them, not just in terms of transport, but across the piece. So I think there is an urgent need for consistent national local messaging on the scale of change that's required and more insight about how that can be delivered. And so it was encouraging that the local authority toolkit was announced in the transport decarbonisation plan as one mechanism through which we can help to address some of these challenges. And we at UK 100 will be working hard to advocate to ensure that does work for the spectrum of local authorities wherever they sit upon it. So I've alluded a little bit there to what we'll be working on at UK 100, but there are a number of other key advocacy asks that we're currently developing. So one of the key recommendations, perhaps the key recommendation of Power Shift, was the need for a net zero delivery framework, which will clarify the relationship between local and national action. And it will be comprehensive, so it will not just explore the policies, but explore the funding and financing mechanisms, ensure that those skills and expertise that do exist can be pooled, and to play a role in evaluation, learning and acceleration of change. So we have another report coming out fairly shortly, which will examine what that delivery framework could look like, and we'll be working hard with colleagues in the national government to try and build some momentum around the idea. We had a local and national net zero leadership summit back in July, where 32 leaders from across 5 political parties all signed up to a series of asks across sectors. The ask of the communique from the transport sector was immediate action to reduce the high cost of connecting EV charging to the grid across the UK. And so that's another area where we're investing a lot of our time at the moment. Thirdly, we are asking for more powers to require bus and train operators to collaborate within a framework on area-wide transport plans. And that includes cross-ticketing and broadening the scope of Highways England's duty to cooperate to ensure that consideration of emission reduction schemes outside of the strategic road network involve Highways England. And finally, I've already spoken to this point, but we want to see local authority access to pooled funding specifically for delivering net zero transport investments based on strategic case for action rather than micromanaged scheme assessment within the current web tag system. So we will be working with our members to ensure that each local authority has a clear pathway to net zero and that transport's contribution is identified and quantified, to ensure that all local transport plans feed in and recognise the scale of the climate emergency and the bold measures and the comprehensive spectrum of measures that will be required to deliver that pathway, to take stock and identify the resources that they think would be required to deliver on the scale required, and to ensure that emphasis is placed in terms of the scale of change is required. And in working, as we saw with the transport decarbonisation plans, highlighted text that local authorities are working with business partners, with communities, to bring them on the journey with them. So I'll leave it there. But
and Ben kindly will move on the slides if possible. So if we go to the first slide. Shall I introduce myself?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've given a very brief, I mean, it couldn't have been briefer who you are and where you work, but feel free to, elaborate on that one, David.
Well, maybe just to add again that I work in transport policy in Welsh Government. So I'm talking from a perspective of the work that we've done in Wales with our partners, Arup and Transport for Quality of Life, and Ben is obviously here from Arup to elaborate on some of this work. So first of all, maybe I should set out before we begin that Wales has its own targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Earlier this year, the Welsh Parliament agreed legislation for net zero by 2050. And this was an increase from the previous ambition for an 80% target and a more recent target recommended by the UK Climate Change Committee for 95%. So we've kind of progressed quite far in terms of targets over the last few years, and we now have a net zero target for 2050. Also importantly, I think, we also have interim targets and 5-year carbon budgets included within the legislation. So they're shown here as clouds or little puffs of smoke for some reason, but these have a key role in driving our policies to decarbonise the Welsh economy. So you know, the focus is on short term as well as the 2050 target. Thanks, Ben. Here's another way to look at it. This is a graph from the UK Committee on Climate Change showing greenhouse gas emissions over the period from 1990. Actually, it doesn't look too bad if you look at that sort of black trajectory. It gives the impression that possibly we're following a straight line trajectory down to zero in 2050. What you can't see from the graph is that the emission savings to date in Wales have primarily been as a result of decarbonising the energy sector in Wales, closing coal-fired power stations, for instance. Undoubtedly a difficult thing, and it's a notable achievement, but this doesn't really impact on individuals, on Welsh citizens. Individuals won't notice if their electricity is produced from coal or from renewables. And also arguably, the more difficult task now is to tackle the remaining emissions from here, moving on to 2050. So this graph then shows specifically the transport emissions in Wales since 1990, and probably as elsewhere, quite common across the globe. Cars make over half of the emissions, and van emissions are also increasing. Buses represent about 3% of surface transport emissions in Wales. Railways are very little, around about 1%. But the story in terms of cars, they're generally increasing in efficiency, but we're travelling more than ever. So in Wales, traffic has grown by 45% between 1993 and 2019. And in 2019 was the highest on record at 32.1 billion vehicle kilometres, or about 6,300 miles per person on average. Just to clarify, within the transport emissions for Wales, we also account for aviation and shipping in our carbon budgets for transport. Thanks, Ben. So we've been developing transport policies to be included in a new publication, Net Zero Wales, we're going to call it, which covers all our emitting sectors in Wales, and focuses primarily on our immediate carbon budget period, so 21 to 25, and also 26 to 30. So those carbon budget 2 and carbon budget 3, we call them. As you can see, it has been quite a long process from the declaration of the climate emergency in 2019, advice from the UK Committee on Climate Change, our statutory advisors, setting the emission targets within the Welsh legislation, and then moving on to developing policies in time for the publication of the plan in advance of COP26 in November. So we've got quite a strict timescale. No room for kind of delays on that. It needs to get out in time for COP26. The advice that was received from the UK Committee on Climate Change included a number of emission reduction scenarios for transport, with a central balanced pathway scenario showing a halving of emissions from transport over the decade to 2030. So if you think back to the previous slide where we have this sort of business as usual, no change since 1990, that's quite a significant change for us to effect. Thanks, Ben. So our aim from the start of the process was to develop what we can call credible policies. And what I mean by credible policies is ones that have been costed and quantified in terms of the carbon savings in comparison to the business as usual scenario. So we show this as a cost per tonne of carbon saved, the carbon value of a policy. In theory, this then assists us to compare policies in terms of the efficiency in reducing carbon per pound, not only across the transport sector, but also in comparison with other emitting sectors in Wales, such as housing, industry, etc. Of course, we also have to consider other possible benefits from the policies, and particularly for transport, there are many benefits such as health and air quality benefits from moves to active travel, for instance, and these are captured by the cost effectiveness indicator, which is, I think, a Bayes derived kind of indicator. In Wales, we also have a duty to develop policy under the guidance of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and this is what this kind of diagram shows here. It's a specific act that we have in Wales, so all our policy has to reflect these kind of aspirations which cover future prosperity, health, equality, etc. So we're not just considering the kind of base cost of carbon, we're also considering other elements within our kind of decisions. Thanks, Ben. So our approach to developing the transport policies that go into Net Zero Wales was to develop thematic papers. And this is where we commissioned our consultants, Arup and Transport for Quality of Life to lead on, really exploring the potential policies under each transport theme. There are probably about 10 to 12 themes, which looked at topics such as modal shift to active travel, mode shift to public transport, remote working, land use planning, switch to zero emission vehicles, zero emission HGVs, rail, shipping, all these kind of different sectors. But essentially you can put the policies into two kind of categories, which are shown. You probably can't read them, but the two central columns. One is policies to reduce vehicle kilometres, and then the other is policies to reduce the carbon intensity of that travel. So you can kind of see one is more kind of behavioural change related, and one is more on the technology side. Some of the policies are devolved to the Welsh Government, such as active travel, for instance. Other policies are retained by the UK Government. Specifically, I guess a good example is legislation around vehicle standards and emissions, etc. And some of those policies have a big impact on whether we will kind of achieve our targets for decarbonising in the short term in Wales. Thanks, Ben. This gives a bit of an example of, within those thematic papers, the kind of approach that was taken. So Arup and TFQL looked at two kind of aspects. One was a costed bottom-up assessment of if you spent this kind of money, what kind of impact would you see? And then secondly, they also assessed a kind of top-down assessment, which looked at the best in Europe in this kind of field. So for instance, you would look at the Netherlands for active travel provision. And I think that gave a good kind of idea of the sort of well, the context really, and the parameters for this kind of work. Thanks, Ben. This is a kind of visual description of cycling facilities. So you look at if Wales had Dutch-style facilities and cycling culture, etc. This particular slide shows how many people would you potentially get to cycle to work, to commute into work by bike, and it looks at also the potential of a sort of e-bike scenario where there's a much greater uptake of e-bikes, similar to what we're seeing in some countries in Europe. And how would that look like in Wales? Thanks, Ben. A key early outcome of the work that was undertaken was to feed into the development of the new Wales transport strategy, which we published in March of this year. The strategy reflects the ambitions of the Welsh Government to encourage a modal shift to more sustainable travel. And you'll see there we have included a target for at least 45% of journeys to be made by public transport or active travel by 2040. And there are interim targets which we'll include within the Net Zero Wales strategy related to that. The transport strategy also includes our sustainable transport hierarchy, and I guess the lots of similar kind of hierarchies in other strategies. But this now guides the prioritisation of new investment in transport. The Welsh Government recently announced a pause and review on road building in Wales. And the purpose of that is to check the compatibility of new road building schemes with this hierarchy, and also with a potential impact on carbon emissions. Thanks, Ben. This is a graph again from the Climate Change Committee. This shows the balanced net zero pathway for surface transport in the UK. The top line shows the kind of business as usual scenario, where we see an increase in emissions up to 2050, while the bottom dotted line shows the reduction in emissions if that balanced pathway is followed. Much of the devolved policy and main influence of Welsh Government is on that top kind of green reducing demand wedge through modal shift, demand reduction measures like the sort of planning policy and modal shift, etc. Generally, what we found is that these interventions are quite expensive when assessed on value of carbon only. But then if you add the benefits, for example, to health, which are measured through the cost effectiveness indicators, then the value is much higher. Some areas, of course, are quite difficult to decarbonise at the moment, such as HGVs, etc. because the technology isn't there. And then for the transition to zero emission cars, we're very dependent on the actions of the UK government. So our focus from Welsh government policies is on supporting measures such as the provision of electric vehicle charging. And it's quite difficult to measure what the impact of that particular policy would be within that kind of bottom purple wedge. Thanks, Ben. So this gives some sort of specific actions that we hope to include within the Net Zero Wales. We're at a kind of crucial stage now with a document where it's going to ministers for their view, and also discussions around the funding for the plan that's starting. So, but in terms of kind of specific actions that we hope to include are things like action on remote working. The Welsh Government has made specific commitments that it wants to encourage at least 30% of the workforce to work from home at some time during the week. And there are proposed trials of remote working hubs to enable that. Electric vehicle charging, we've recently published a strategy setting out how we will support an increase in the provision of EV charging. With specific commitments related to public transport decarbonisation and zero emission bus and zero emission taxi fleet by 2028. There's lots of work still ongoing, particularly on the sort of bus target, which is really ambitious. Active travel, that's something that our Deputy Minister, who's in charge of transport, is very passionate about. So we're seeing a massive increase in investment for a really big change in active travel provision. Land use planning, very much looking at how decisions can be consistent with our new national development framework. I think the policy is there, it's more about the delivery. Demand management, discussions around what the role of demand management will be. Micromobility, new options sort of available now. And then looking at identifying freight consolidation opportunities to look at decarbonisation of freight. And then in terms of shipping and aviation, it's very much a sort of UK policy, but we'd be keen really as a Welsh Government to see support for innovation, to trial ideas, things for shipping, for instance, is onshore power, etc. So very much sort of complementary activity on that front. Thanks, Ben. So key conclusions from us. It's been a very worthwhile exercise. We have this is our second kind of decarbonisation plan, and I think there's been a step change in understanding the issues by assessing the carbon value and the cost of effectiveness of specific policies. Demand reduction, modal shift and less travel is essential to achieve the Committee on Climate Change's carbon reduction pathway, but it's very challenging and potentially needs a lot of investment. The main emission savings, I think we probably agree with the Committee on Climate Change that the main savings will come from electric cars. But it's very sensitive to the rate of EV uptake, and we don't really know in terms of the population in Wales whether the uptake will be slower than more wealthier areas of the UK, for instance. We can take a no regrets approach that we need additional action now to mitigate that potentially slow EV uptake. and of course, the maximum potential modal shift is potentially, the potential there is much larger than just from the sort of bottom-up modelling that we've suggested. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. And just apologies there when earlier on there was a mute button was missing from my screen, but I found it now. So my name's Ben Pritchard, and I am an associate director in Arup, and I'm based in Cardiff, and I lead the consulting business in Wales, but do work across the UK. So yeah, I just thought Friday afternoon, I thought I'd leave a few provocations really around some discussions that we've been having around steps to action, and we've really kind of been thinking of the company quite hard about some of the challenges that local authorities, regions, private sector, right across the board. This does lean on some of the work that Welsh Government have been doing, and when I've shared that with colleagues, it has provoked some interesting discussions. So I'll just take you through those 10 shortly. I guess firstly, just to say that we know that the transport sector is responsible for 24% of carbon, and we really need to recalibrate the way that kind of works. And I think it's a really important time. We've got the decarbonisation plan, we've got COP26 at the summit, and it's really important that we look at different ways of people moving around, goods interacting and moving around. Something that was said earlier that I think is really true is that authorities are at different stages, and that's not a problem. We just need to accept that, and it doesn't matter where you think you are on that pathway. I think the important thing is to start that movement and moving forward, really. So just about sort of resilience, a comment there really. We've seen flooded metro stations, we've seen power outages, we've seen collapsed bridges. Climate change can prevent a lot of issues there. As part of the net zero transitions, we've got to support clients in our case to adapt their assets and their systems to tackle these climate risks. But resilience also covers the health risks we've seen with COVID-19, also market resilience, the financial implications of global markets on the ability to decarbonise. What lessons are we learning is the question that I think we've got to ask ourselves. I'm really pleased Karen mentioned this as well. It's really interesting area, but the scale of response to decarbonisation is significant. I think the ability to kind of get the capital side of that is reasonably sort of better in a way, but you can't spend your way out of this. I don't think we're not going to solve this by putting more and more money towards it. I think it's about really adapting and being ready to adapt. And part of that is having the revenue funding and the ability to adapt skills or to bring in new skills and approaches, and setting out what that model is. And I guess I was looking at a couple of papers, and there was something which sort of really spoke to this for me, and it was over the last 10 years. It was an ICR update review, and it was the period sort of 2010 to 2018. And it looks at the different sectors, and it's the one that talks about transport sector increasing by sort of 3.9% in that period between sort of 2010 to 2018. At the same time, the other sectors, just to remind those and for those who haven't heard it before, energy reduced by 37.3% in terms of the same period. Energy carbon consumption, waste reduced by 33%, comms industry just over 19%, and water, I think it was 6%. And that kind of made me really think that the transport sector was the only one that wasn't taking those steps as a whole to reduce those emissions. And how do we alleviate that? Most of that kind of carbon is kind of end user, we recognise that, but there are some successes, and I think the Green Construction Board looked at the construction practices around that, and there are some great reductions that they've got direct control over, so capital and operational carbon. So what are the lessons there, and how do we sort of take that into the behavioural reductions that we need to undertake over the next 10 years and more? Talk about sort of transport and spatial planning. There'll be lots of people who are sort of experts in this, and I often, many of us would have been sat in planning committees where, the seeming policies and strategies that were in place, and even sometimes the officer report seemed to align, and then the decision at the last doesn't quite match that expectation. And we know there are lots of different influencing factors, but how in that chain do we reinforce it? And I did say, I like that advocacy item that Karen mentioned earlier about local authority access to pooled funding, because it's something we kind of talked about. Could you use that in this example? But just to say, the basis for spatial planning tends to be pretty good. I think in the UK, I guess we probably see there's a need for enforcement of that and the evolution over time. Remote working been a really interesting challenge in that spatial context. That has really changed our thinking, but there are some great opportunities. And I think we do need to understand the long-term impacts of remote working. We're seeing in Ireland and in Wales that they're really looking at how the models of hubs, for example, actually influence perhaps some of those harder to reach areas. How does that help with inequality? How does that help with social deprivation? Because these things are really important alongside just looking at decarbonisation. And I think the spatial planning impact of that needs to be thought about in a systematic way when it comes to transport and spatial planning. Talked about the focus, I guess, on active travel. I think it's a key building block. The health, well-being and social benefits are clear. Prioritising walking, the production of those local cycling and walking infrastructure plans are critical. There is government funding for the next tranche of active travel that's available to help some of these schemes get delivered. But we need to tackle sort of inequalities for cycling as well, and that's not just by the people, but that's by the place as well. There are some areas that need that investment, and I would refer to the pandemic responses. There were some great responses across the UK that we saw new cycle lanes implemented. That level of experimentation was really good, and some local authorities just did a great job. I thought, let's give credit where credit's deserved. Really raised the profile of what could be done in a short period of time. And we don't shout about it enough. I think we should shout about it a bit more, is how I feel. And that innovative alternative way of operating is a clue that, given the time and space and investment, is that as a community, there are people there who can take on that challenge. As I was referring about operational readiness in terms of, say, some of the skills that are needed. My footnote in that, I guess, is that we really need to influence the politicians in this area and that ongoing political support, because I think we all know that active travel is absolutely critical. And then just looking at sort of the involvement of local communities, how are we, planning for people, and systems? Really important to get local communities involved. And one of the examples I think of here, and are we doing this enough? There was an example in Cardiff around Greener Grangetown. It's a sustainable urban drainage scheme, really at its heart. And you've got the elders in that community wanted, a pleasant place to spend time. You wanted people who were moving through that area. They wanted their commuter routes, cycling routes, to be as good as they had ever been. And it was a really good retrofit. There was some great biodiversity in there. There was some really good sort of alternative in terms of design, and the community helped to design it. And it's really increased in terms of its profile. It's changed the nature of that area. So I use that as an example of saying that actually it's really supported active travel, but it's opened up, I think, the opportunities for communities. So how do we get people to be in that space where they're engaged enough that they can take something on that they, over time, that they continue to use and be proud of? And just in that particular example, the planters are maintained largely by the residents. And if you cycle through there, just look it up, Greener Grangetown. It looks great, feels great. It's on my commute to work as well. I love it every time I go past it. And there's loads of people cycling and walking through there, whether they're pushchairs or the like. So it's that sort of response, and retrofitting is critical, because a lot of our cities, in terms of the age of the housing, etc., had some difficulties there. So combining multiple strands together, and you only do that through talking to people, I think, in the communities. And it wouldn't be any surprise to say that now is, the time not to shy away from difficult decisions in achieving, carbon emissions. It is going to be slightly radical thinking away from traditional forms of reducing vehicle dominance and emissions. I think the local authorities do have a lot of say in this, so I support what was said earlier. But just to perhaps spell out some of the difficult decisions, I mean, demand management can mean many different things, workplace sort of parking levies, it can mean clean air zones, or low emission zones in some cases they're called. And I think we just need to recognise that in that theme of demand management, there are opportunities for revenue generation. And it's the way that, if you ask me, would I like to pay more? I would always probably say no. But if you ask me if I would like to contribute toward making my city more sustainable and having sort of different opportunities to move around, I'd probably be thinking, yeah, I'd be interested to know more. Are we influencing politicians in the right way, in the wider benefits, so that they can take these brave decisions? Because they are difficult and in a political arena. And I think as a sort of industry around transport planning, and we need to influence, we need to look at the business case around these in a way that's politically acceptable. Talk about the obviously electrification, of fleets. Bus Back Better, 3 billion of funding available to transition the local bus fleet to low emission. There's opportunities for enhanced partnership by April 22 to access long-term bus funding. I know some of the work that Arup has been doing around this has looked at hydrogen buses as well, not just sort of electric fleet in the Liverpool City region, for example. So I think there's some great opportunities in the fleet. And in Wales, they've been looking at the bus bill and given themselves the powers there to run a more efficient network at scale. And it does require kind of network-wide changes as well. So getting the fleet is one thing, but I think then getting the actual systems and routes together is quite another. Just to talk about, it's absolutely critical here, Welsh Government around data. So Welsh Government were able to pull together with the work that David talked about some really good data sets and background that enabled influencing of decision making. There's often a gap in these data sets, and I think as people are you only really hit the challenge when you sort of get to it. And I think taking a step back, understanding what data is needed in terms of supporting decision making, so using the National Travel Survey in the right way, for example, accessing open source data that's available. This can be done much quicker than it was, and I think we all need to upskill, and people need to be aware of the potential for this data. In the work that David talked about, you could assimilate sort of health, travel and carbon data in a way that allowed you to make decisions that looked at other sectors other than just transport. And I think it's at the political level that's really important. So in all of our respective roles and jobs, do we understand that enough? Do we know what data is needed, and do we know that evidence base? And I think investing in that now is going to be very useful going forward. And a part of that data set, we need to understand travel patterns. Some of the baseline assumptions around movement are not quite right. We're just following them, and we're seeing how they adapt. An example, for us, with Innovate UK, we worked with Birmingham City Council to use agent-based modelling, and that we're looking at open source data to try and understand how the pandemic was influencing decisions in Birmingham. And I think what's really interesting about the use of ABMs in that case is you're able to drill down into society. So you're able to understand the role of gender, age, ethnicity in terms of decision making. And I think that's been in the political arena. I think that's very important. If you really can understand that finite influence of changes on people, then that gives you an opportunity to mitigate it. So again, I'd encourage people to consider, have they got the right understanding, and how does that need to be updated? And of course, I think sort of last but not least, in the near future, we have the electric vehicle boom that's coming our way. And take a lead on this. There is obviously a strong private sector role and influence in here. But I think looking at the business case for filling in the gaps, typically, the inequalities around ownership of electric vehicles, the role the public sector might play in helping to influence the location of charging infrastructure. And certainly that's something that I've seen in Wales, and some of the work that's being done by Welsh Government. Their electric vehicle strategy is making sure that no one gets left behind. And they've got a really good confidence about EVs now. They've built up their understanding, and they're starting to to make some really good decisions around where they invest and how they invest in partnership. And one of the examples that they've got there, which I think is worth taking elsewhere, is community energy generation. And they've been aligning community energy generation with charge points, battery storage, and opening up that opportunity. And if there is a profit to be made, that goes back into the community. And I think that kind of social enterprise model is something that people should be considering elsewhere. So yeah, Friday afternoon, a quick fly through of some provocations, some ideas, some thoughts, some things that you might ponder or have questions on. But thank you. And back to you, Rebecca.